to welcome you to this webinar on behalf of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, which is sponsoring this webinar. And then the Physicists Coalition itself is sponsored by the American Physical Society. This webinar is motivated by the goals of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. The goals are to engage the physics community in the issue of nuclear weapons and to build a network of advocates, physicists, citizen advocates who can advocate for steps to reduce the threat from nuclear weapons. And so this webinar is very much tuned to our goals. The purpose of this webinar is for us to learn and to discuss how nuclear policy is made in the United States, how it's influenced, and also to get some recent information on the current landscape in nuclear policy making and the political landscape. So that's the purpose of the webinar. It's the first of several monthly webinars that we're going to hold over the summer. We'll hold one in July, August, maybe in September. So please stay tuned for further announcements on the webinar in July, which will be on the effects, the physical effects of the use of nuclear weapons, sometimes called the humanitarian consequences. I might mention that the Physicists Coalition is open to all physical scientists, not just card-carrying physicists, anybody who works in the very broad area of physical science, including engineering science. And the Physicists Coalition gives members an opportunity not just to update their information on nuclear weapons, but to really advocate for steps to reduce the threat. So if you're interested in learning about the coalition, you can go to our coalition website, which I think is going to be posted in the chat. And if you want to join the coalition, you can do that through the website or through a special link, which is also being posted in the chat. The plan for today is that we're going to spend 1 hour hearing from 2 experts on how it's done in the administration and in Congress. And of that 1 hour, about a third will be reserved for question and discussion. That will be followed by a 25-minute session where we'll discuss a current advocacy campaign which is underway by the Physicists Coalition to advocate for a no first use policy in the United States. So you'll hear about a live advocacy campaign that's going on right now. So that's the hour and a half that's coming up. Before we begin, let me just make one note. Although this webinar is hosted by the APS, there will be open discussion, and any opinions expressed represent only those of the individuals expressing them, not necessarily of the APS. So with that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to the moderator for our next session, and that's Zia Mian from Princeton. So Zia.
Thank you, Stewart. Welcome, everyone. My name is Zia Mian. I'm a physicist, and I'm the co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security. And together with Stewart and some other colleagues, I am one of the founders of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. My task here is to introduce the 2 speakers in our first session on influencing government policy on nuclear weapons. They will each speak for about 20 minutes, and there'll be time for brief questions following each talk, and then a more general question and discussion session at the end. There also will be time for discussion after the next session, after the discussion about no first use, and there will be time for questions for our presenters at that time also. So our speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they will speak, are Sharon Weiner, who is Associate Professor of International Relations in the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C., and a visiting researcher at Princeton's program on science and global security. She has served as a program examiner with the National Security Division of the White House Office of Management and Budget, where she had responsibility for budget and policy issues related to nuclear weapons and non-proliferation. Her previous government service includes the Joint Staff's Strategic Plans and Policy Directorate, the House Armed Services Committee, and as an advisor to the Office of a U.S. Senator. Our second speaker will be Stephen Young, who is Senior Washington Representative of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Stephen works with members of Congress and administration officials in the media to advance security-related campaigns, largely focusing on arms control, nuclear weapons policy, missile defense, and nuclear threat reduction programs. Before joining UCS, Stephen was Deputy Director of the Coalition to Reduce Nuclear Dangers, an alliance of 17 nuclear disarmament organizations. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers, and let me hand it over first to Professor Sharon Weiner.
Okay, thank you very much, Zia. So my task today is to explain to you the broad contours of the budget process as it relates to nuclear weapons. And as I'm sure many of you know, money is policy. So this is also a primer on the policy process by which many decisions are made. So I want you to take away three things from this conversation. So the first is the notion that the main cause of any given budget is actually inertia. So the biggest predictor of next year's budget on nuclear weapons, as it is for most budget issues, is actually last year's budget. And this is partially a consequence of the time it takes agencies to produce budgets. But the important thing here is that once something's in the budget, it becomes much more difficult to stop than before it gets in the budget. So that's one takeaway. The second is that the takeaway is that the biggest influence on any budget is actually the agency itself. So in the case of nuclear weapons, this is two agencies, the Department of Defense, and then the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA. And as many of you will know, NNSA is a quasi-independent part of the Department of Energy. So the thing to keep in mind is that the nuclear weapons budget requires some coordination between the Defense Department, which focuses on the delivery systems, missiles, subs, airplanes, and NNSA, which actually builds the warheads and produces the fissile material and the components for nuclear weapons. Okay, so delivery systems and warheads. So that means that the two predominant influences on the budget are the Defense Department and NNSA. The third thing that I want you to take away is that even though inertia has a huge role to play and that agencies are the big determinants of nuclear weapons spending, there's a schedule to the budget process. That schedule is predictable, and that means there are windows of opportunity for when people can influence the budget. It also means that there are times that no matter how brilliant your idea or how much you want to do to change something, if you're not in sync with the budget process, your chances of influence are minimal. So my goal today is to explain that calendar and that process to you and give you some resources that you can use if you want to influence this thing. So I'm going to start with that window of opportunity. It's called autumn. Literally September, October, November. These are the months when the Defense Department and NNSA submit their budget requests to the Office of Management and Budget. So they literally submit something that says, please include this in the president's budget request. This is what we would like. OMB then considers these requests, looks at any items that are undecided, notes issues that may seem to contradict presidential policy, and also looks for issues that are poorly justified, and tees up for the director of OMB a series of alternatives for major budget issues that haven't been resolved, or when top lines are too high and they need to be reduced, it'll tee up alternatives to be considered for how to do that reduction. So this culminates in a review in front of the director of OMB, where the director of OMB then makes recommendations and decisions to the White House for what should or should not be included in the president's final budget request to Congress, which of course happens between January and February. So the key thing to keep in mind is autumn is prime time to try and influence some of these controversial issues. Another thing to keep in mind is for the last 10 years, budgets have been considered under various different amendments to what was initially the Budget Control Act of 2011. So these spending caps basically said you could only spend so much money on defense. And if you wanted to spend more, then there had to be trade-offs, okay? The last set of amendments to this process expired with fiscal year 2021. So it's not clear what's going to happen with the fiscal year 2022 budget. but I would keep my eye on that, because basically if you're seeking to influence policy, having some kind of budget cap is actually helpful because it means trade-offs have to be made. So after the director's review at OMB, OMB will give agencies directions for how to amend their budgets. And this is a process called pass back. So literally OMB passes back to NNSA and to DoD directions that say, you need to reduce this budget, this program doesn't fit in, you should increase spending in this area, but not in this area. Usually a set of instructions that cover maybe a dozen items, maybe less than that. Basically the most controversial items that are in the budget, or things that really contradict presidential priorities. Of course, the Defense Department and NNSA can fight back. And so there's a period of time towards the first part of the winter, end of November, 1st of December, again, it varies a little bit every year, where the agencies will look at this direction they were given from OMB and try to decide, well, do we give in, or do we really broaden the political discussion of this and try and, leak some of the things that we were given, get congressional allies to advocate for us with the White House, mobilize other supporters in defense industry, whatever. But it's a very short period of time when this has to happen, and intentionally so, because of course OMB doesn't want this external political pressure. There's also the possibility that the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Defense can appeal directly to the White House. So it is an intensely political process, this time between pass back and then what's called settlement, where OMB and the agencies agree on what's going to be in the final budget. Everybody signs on the dotted line, it's linked in, and it's supposed to appear, and usually does, in the president's final budget request, which happens, like I said, in January. So this process, this period between September and November, when the agency submits its budget and OMB's considering it, is the prime time to influence how to consider these alternatives. Okay, so here's why. Let me pull out two important parts to this process. One is OMB, Office of Management and Budget. OMB does not do cost estimates. It does not do schedule analysis. It does not do an analysis of alternatives. Instead, all those things are done by agencies. Well, so then what does OMB do? OMB basically scours the public debate, scours GAO reports, CBO reports, anything it can get its hands on to help it understand what it is being told by DoD and NNSA. Because of course, the nuclear weapons bureaucracies are providing information in support of the things they want. There's no inbuilt contradictory force within the government to hold them accountable for the analysis they're doing and to say, oh, well, wait a minute, you know what? This probably isn't right, or here are the risks of doing this. Agencies don't present alternatives to the things they want. They present the things they want. So OMB goes out and looks more broadly for what other people are saying on the topic. So this is where you come in. Analysis that is easy to digest by people who are policy experts, but not necessarily scientifically experts, is super helpful to people trying to understand alternatives to what agencies are being proposed. So in the fall is the time to publish policy relevant pieces in non-scientific jargon in places that are easy to find. So for example, Arms Control Today, easy to find place. The Journal of Atmospheric Physics, I don't know if this exists, I'm a political scientist, not so easy to find. So you want to make your argument digestible to people who need to digest it and easy to find. There's another part of this process that it's important to know, and that's the question of, so just how many people at OMB are actually responsible for the nuclear weapons budget? How many people have the nuclear weapons budget as their primary mission? Okay, so this is actually a trick question, because there's no nuclear weapons budget. There's a budget in NNSA, okay, warheads. I think there are probably currently 2 people in OMB with primary responsibility for this. On the DoD side of the equation, maybe 2 or 3. One of them is responsible for the Air Force, not the nuclear Air Force, the entire Air Force. In the Navy, for the Navy, there's one person there, again, responsible for everything the Navy does. So think of it this way. You have overworked people with huge responsibilities who can't do cost assessment and program evaluation on their own, and they are desperate for your inputs. They need to read them in a language that they can understand, that is relevant to the policy debates that are happening, and it needs to come in the fall when they can use that information. The very best analysis on converting naval reactors to something else, if it comes in January, is not helpful for the budget process. Okay. The second thing I want to point out in this is I keep saying OMB, 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 OMB. I have not said the National Security Council. I have not said the White House. I have not said the Office of Science and Technology Policy. These places are certainly important, and they certainly are deeply involved in policy making and in deciding things through a process that takes place called the IPC process. But these folks often do not interface with OMB, and they sometimes tend to forget that all initiatives need money and that the budget and money getting process follows a calendar. For example, one of my roles in OMB, and this was an informal role that I did for friends in the National Security Council, was that periodically they would invite me to policy meetings, policy discussions, because someone in the White House would have an idea that they wanted to get through. And of course, you had to be responsive to the White House and you had to discuss this. And then some NSC person, senior director for something or other, would call on me and say, "Isn't that right, OMB?" At which point I would stand up and say, "I'm sorry, the budget process has concluded and there is no money for your initiative." At which point things would stop. You can't do anything in the government unless you have money. To have money, you have to have an appropriation and in many cases an authorization from Congress. And that happens once, if we're lucky, during a fiscal year. And if you miss that, you are waiting for the next fiscal year for your world-saving initiative. Okay. Few exceptions to this, but by and large, they do not apply to policy discussions and policy initiatives about nuclear weapons issues. There's often a lack of understanding for the role of OMB on the part of OSTP and the National Security Council. Part of this, even though they're all in the White House, not technically in the White House, but in the White House office, there's some structural differences. OMB is composed of career people, not political. This means that their function is essentially somewhat different from NSC, OSTP, and other things. Okay. They often don't know each other. And so one of the suggestions that I would make for people who want to influence policy is to recognize that anyone who wants to change policy needs to know the NSC or the OSTP person, and that person needs to know the OMB examiner that they can take their concerns to, or say, "Hey, have you seen this analysis? Have you thought about this thing?" That's a nice connection to be able to make. OMB needs the National Security Council and OSTP because OMB examiners have no authority on their own to insert an idea into a policy discussion. No authority. They need to be able to say, here are, the National Security Council has asked for alternatives on nuclear pit production, and here are some alternatives that we have seen. An OMB program examiner has no authority to do that on their own. So there needs to be this relationship. The NSC and OSTP need to depend upon OMB because they know the budget and the process, and OMB needs to understand that there are alternatives and ideas that come from the NSC and OSTP. But often those folks, like I said, don't know each other and don't know the schedule and the processes and the goals that the others are working on because they're fundamentally different creatures. One is focused on the goal of getting a budget out, and the other is a political agenda for an administration. So here's my recipe for influencing policy. Publish your idea, analysis, whatever, in a policy relevant journal. Do it again, 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 again. Find the NSC or the OSTP person and get them to read it. Do this by September. Ask them to discuss your idea with the OMB program examiner. If that examiner has also read about your idea, this increases your chances of actually making an impact. Now, let me shift briefly to the inertia that comes with the budget from the Defense Department and NNSA. So if you're interested in being influential in a particular part of the nuclear weapons budget or policy development, my advice is to invest a lot of time in figuring out where your thing appears in the budget, because this will take an investment of time. That's because there is no such thing as the nuclear weapons budget. There are just multiple pieces of that budget. And so you need to figure out and understand where the piece that you're interested in comes from. So I'm going to start with NNSA. This is the easy one. And I've dropped in the chat box the link that'll take you to the most recent NNSA budget justification. And this is usually the place where you can find lots of different budget justifications. So this is, as I said, NNSA is part of the Department of Energy. Department of Energy's budget justification has multiple volumes. Volume 1 is always NNSA. And if you open up this thing, you'll discover that there are actually what are called 4 different appropriations lines that are related to, that are NNSA's budget. And the reason to be familiar with the different parts of the budget is because Congress appropriates money for NNSA as one of 4 things: federal salaries and expenses, weapons activities, non-proliferation, or naval reactors. Those are the only 4 things for which money is appropriated. Everything else fits into one of those categories. Okay. So money is specifically appropriated for these things, and it cannot be moved between these categories without the specific approval of Congress, which rarely happens. So for example, within weapons activities, why does this matter? So let's say a program within weapons activities is canceled, or it goes really far behind schedule and they can't spend all of their money. And you think, aha, this is my chance to grab that money and spend it on a non-proliferation effort. No, it's actually not. Congress may agree to reprogram the money, but it's going to stay in weapons activities. It is not going to be reprogrammed for use in non-proliferation, because those are 2 separate appropriations lines. So here's another trick, though, that you might want to watch for, which would allow that little skip, and that's redefining a program. So let's say, so in general, NNSA would actually rather spend money on weapons activities than on non-proliferation. It's just the labs have more of an emphasis on that. So let's say you want to study about converting naval reactors, the reactors in submarines, from HEU to LEU, right? There's no money for that. There's no money for that in weapons activities, and the people in weapons activities really don't like to do it. There's no money for it in naval reactors. They don't want to do it. So you redefine the program as non-proliferation, reducing fissile materials, right? That would be what you would have to do to get it funded through the non-proliferation part of NNSA. The problem is you probably just killed some other non-proliferation program by doing it. So in addition to NNSA's budget, if you're interested in these issues, I also recommend NNSA's Stockpile Stewardship and Management Plan, the SSMP. So for the issue that you're interested in, comparing the budget justification and the SSMP will allow you to understand future plans, aspirations. Basically, the SSMP can be more aspirational and controlled by NNSA than the budget can. And so comparing and contrasting the language and what's said there can be really helpful to help you understand basically what the budget maybe isn't saying, but is still an active debate within the agency. Now, unfortunately, the Defense Department budget is significantly harder. So what I just dropped in the chat there is what's called the Green Book. This is the Defense Department Comptroller's budget for all of the Defense Department. Here you can find a historical budget, figures, a variety of different justifications for different things. What you will not find is anything about the nuclear weapons budget. For that, you have to go to the Air Force and the Navy. So these are the budget documents for the Air Force and the Navy. And here you can find specific lines for different nuclear weapons things. But here the key thing to remember is even the service budgets are not categorized by this type of weapon or this type of weapon. They're categorized as money to operate and maintain things, money to build construction, money to procure things, and money to do research, development, test, and evaluation. So to understand the budget for nuclear weapons in the Defense Department, you need to understand where your weapon is in that phase. And also different components of it come in different places. Bottom line here is I'm going to recommend 2 experts to you who do this on a routine basis and whose analysis I would trust. One is Kingston Reef at the Arms Control Association, and the second is Todd Harris at CSIS. I'm running out of time here. If I had more time, and I would happy to respond, I'll just say really quickly. 1, DoD covers delivery and NSA warheads. How do they get harmonized? That's at a body called the Nuclear Weapons Council. And the Nuclear Weapons Council now has a new process by which the Department of Defense can have more influence on NNSA's budget. We're going to see that play out here for the first time as part of the FY22 budget because it's a brand new thing. I'm going to stop there because I was about to totally nerd out on budget jargon about the difference between budget authority and obligation authority. Just keep in mind, one of the ways to monitor programs is to see how much of the money they've been authorized has actually been spent, because often troubled programs can't spend their money in a timely way. I will stop there and happily answer any questions.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that have been posed, one of which may be immediately relevant here, and the other one we can perhaps save for later on. And that question is, does weapons lab management have any influence on policy through their technical expertise? And connected to that is that you mentioned that the budget process actually begins within the agencies, and that presumably is before the autumn. Is there a way to influence that process from the very bottom at the beginning?
So let me start with the last question. Unless you know someone in an agency or a trusted source for them, it is very hard to influence their budget. Most of the people who build budgets within an agency are not policymakers. They are implementers. And they are building incremental changes to the budget that existed previously. And their careers are usually based on how well they shepherd their particular program through the building, manufacturing, budgeting, analysis process. They are not policymakers. So to influence the service budget or NNSA's budget at that stage, you would basically need to know someone pretty high up in the food chain. And so I'm assuming if you know someone at that level, then you have an in anyway. That's why I say really the opportunity to influence the budget is when the White House has to make choices about it. There are a variety of different places, especially in the Defense Department budget, where issues are considered that are contentious, but that's done in a closed audience that doesn't involve outsiders. And often, you know, the Defense Department doesn't have an incentive to leak those disagreements because they don't want you involved. They want to resolve it themselves. Now, as for the question about the lab contractors, so NNSA as an agency, a lot of their budgets are developed, of course, by the for-profit lab contractors as part of, you know, basically NNSA outsources weapons development to these contractors, and of course they build the budgets. Now there are some, there are differences in how the contractors use money in the sense that, I want to say this quickly. Historically, there's been a tendency of the weapons contractors to, let me just think about how to say this. There's some parts of the budget that weapons contractors can take part of the money for a program and use that for things that make their facilities nicer, or that make it a nicer place to work, or that basically keep the employees there happier, which of course is a legitimate thing to do. But at the end of the day, if you do that too often, you come to Congress and say, you know what, we'd like a great new cafeteria. nobody cares, right? Or you come to Congress and say, money for the life extension program for the B-61 warhead has gone over budget and we need more money for that. That's more compelling to Congress, okay, because it is a requirement, and I'm putting that in quotes because it's actually a choice, not a requirement. But there's some evidence that what's happening is the for-profit contractors are great custodians of the money they can use for their own things, knowing that Congress is actually to give them more money for the warheads that are requirements. But it's a little hard to explain using that process.
So if with that, we have other questions in the Q&A, but I'll save those for after our second presenter. So let me take this moment to hand it over to Stephen and ask him to talk about influencing and informing government policy in Congress. Stephen?
Thanks, Zia. Thanks, Sharon. So yeah, I'm going to take the opportunity to sort of broaden the issue a little bit here and give you my perspective. And just very clear, I have a real perspective on these issues. Coming from the concerned scientists, we support the U.S. having a deterrent for now, but we believe our goal should be abolition, which we're better off in a world where no weapons exist, no weapons exist. And so my focus is very much on trying to influence government policy toward that end. If that's not a view you share, then you might not like what work I'm doing. That's what I've been doing for my career, is working very hard to try and shape government policy to basically reduce the role and the number of nuclear weapons in the world with the ultimate goal of abolition. And that is what I've been focusing on. That goal has been shared by many presidents. And I'm going to talk about basically some of the work we have done in this space over the years. I'm going to try and share my screen and do a PowerPoint. Let's see if this is going to work. All right, does that work? Can people see my screen now? Thank you. All right. So yes, influence government policy on nuclear weapons issues. And I thought I'd just basically start with a few examples. Sharon focused more on the budget, which is hugely important, but there also are policy questions that aren't only budget questions. And I'm going to start with one of those. Basically in the 1990s, the Clinton administration was under a lot of pressure to deploy missile defenses, long-range missile defenses, to try and stop a Russian or Chinese or North Korean nuclear attack on the United States. And UCS has long supported the idea that missile defenses not only are stabilizing politically, they're also unworkable technically. And so UCS convened a panel of scientists, expert scientists, to do a report called Countermeasures, in which we basically, this is actually before my time at UCS, I was actually working with UCS in another group at the time, but UCS had a panel of experts, many very well known, including Dick Garwin and others, who looked at this issue closely and concluded that it basically is impossible to deploy a effective system of missile defenses. They are simply vulnerable to countermeasures. No matter what system you use for missile defenses, they're vulnerable to countermeasures or other simple measures that will overwhelm the system.
Stephen, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're currently in presenter mode, so it's a little hard to see your slide.
Yes, you see the whole thing. All right, so I will switch to slide. Thank you for that. Let me switch to that view. Thank you. Thanks, Sia. Yes, that's much better. There we go. As I was saying, the Clinton administration, in their process, President Clinton then decided late in his term to not deploy missile defenses. And in his statement of why he didn't do it, he included the vulnerability of the system to countermeasures as a reason why it didn't make sense for the US to deploy missile defenses. So it was very clear in an instance where we had an impact. And one of the ways to do that actually was to produce this video. I will very briefly give you a take of how it went, to give you just a sense of the start of it. I won't play the whole thing, which should give you a sense of.
The United States proposes to build a national missile defense system to intercept long-range missiles attacking the US. Here's how it's supposed to work.
So I won't even go further than that. That's just a quick take of the animation we produced that was designed to be comprehensible to the public as well as government officials, the Congress as well. And I think it had a pretty strong impact. Basically, the combination of the report, it was very technical and detailed, and the animation that explained it for the common people made it much easier for all to understand and really help make the case for why the the Clinton administration should not deploy missile defenses, and we got the outcome we were hoping for. They didn't do that. Next example is this Congress focused. So Sharon talked a lot about how the OMB process and how it influenced that. But the reality is, of course, the OMB doesn't have the final say. It's Congress must approve spending. And so that's where I focus much of my work over the years is on getting Congress to stop new weapons programs that we thought were unnecessary, unjust, unwell supported. The first of those I'll talk about is something called the Robust Nuclear Earth Penetrator, which was a system proposed under the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, in the early 2000s. They were arguing that the U.S. needed to have better ability to destroy deeply buried targets, and proposed this robust nuclear earth penetrator as a way to attack those targets effectively. In this debate, many people got confused and thought that because the weapons were penetrating into the ground, they would therefore be contained and the explosion would not be as dangerous. There wouldn't be radiation leakage. There wouldn't be the harm you might expect from nuclear explosion. So this would be a safer nuclear weapon. Was actually sort of it was not true, and the DoD knew it wasn't true, but this sort of Congress wasn't quite sure often and would believe that it would be safe to do. So we did another animation that basically laid out the situation for why, in fact, the explosions would have.
The U.S. wants to develop a new type of nuclear weapon, a nuclear earth penetrator or bunker buster. This nuclear bomb, intended to destroy underground targets, would be useless against many bunkers. At the same time, it would produce.
This is again an example of an animation we've produced that was comprehensible both to Congress, the public as well. And this campaign actually took multiple years. When we initially began opposing it, we had the majority of Democrats in Congress opposing it, but not all of them, and not many Republicans. But we basically, over 4 years, ran a campaign where every year we got more and more votes, and eventually got the support of the Republican chair of the Key Appropriations Committee, David Hobson, who basically agreed with us that this wasn't needed. It wasn't a needed weapon. There wasn't a good justification for it. And they ended up canceling the program through Congress. So by the Bush administration asked for it, funding for it repeatedly, and it was turned down for several years and then basically canceled after several years. Similarly, after that, the Bush tried again and tried a second system called the Reliable Replacement Warhead, which was intentionally sought as a less provocative warhead, the reliable replacement, not a new bunker buster, but a simply more reliable replacing warhead. But again, we felt the system was not justified. And again, we fought it in Congress, and again, we won by basically convincing people that the US did not need new nuclear weapons for its security, that the weapons we already had in the stockpile were reliable and secure. This was aided by a report from the Jasons on plutonium pit lifetime, which concluded that the pits we have in our nuclear warheads were reliable for 100 years. And there was no need to build new warheads to maintain a reliable US nuclear stockpile. So that was a key technical input that helped convince Congress to stop the system. And finally, when Obama came to office in 2009, he canceled this reliable replacement warhead system. Bringing us to Obama, sorry, I need to make this go away. Come on, sorry. There we go. Switching to a more policy-focused one that wasn't as technically focused, let's talk about the Obama administration's nuclear posture review. And this is very much a policy question where we were trying to shape what the Obama administration was going to do on its nuclear posture review. Basically, every administration since Clinton has done a nuclear posture review in which they set out their nuclear policies. It doesn't set the policies themselves. Basically, it's a report saying, here's what we plan to do with our nuclear posture. That includes everything from warheads and weapons to should we have a no first use policy, or should we have a deterrence? Basically, the policies and the posture themselves are all described and set out in the Nuclear Posture Review report. And we sought very hard to shape this report. We produced an analysis together with colleagues from 2 other NGOs, where we set out a piece of recommendations for what should be a nuclear posture review. We also did some public ads. We ran this ad here in things like Politico to try and create the case for how in the post-Cold War era, in the post-9/11 era, it's time to rethink security, and it's time to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in security policy. There's also a line that President Obama himself gave in his Prague speech in 2009. And we actually had a real impact on this as well. So my work in this era was to meet with officials in the administration who are actually working on the nuclear posture review. And I brought in a number of experts, former officials, retired military, who joined in meetings to meet with the officials and talk about these the issues in the posture review. And one meeting in particular, we were talking about the idea that the U.S., one of the goals in this report here was the idea that the U.S. should declare that the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack on the United States. And therefore, if it is their sole purpose to deter attack on the U.S., there'd be no reason for the U.S. ever to use them first. It's sort of a sister policy to a so-called no first use nuclear policy. And in those conversations with the officials, we were actually in a meeting where we were actually describing how you think about these issues. And we were very clear that currently we were strongly opposed to the idea that they could say the primary purpose of nuclear weapons was deterrence. Whether that's just wrong. So the primary, the secondary also implies it's important. And so we said they needed to use the word fundamental instead. And lo and behold, the final policy, this is from the NPR itself, it says the fundamental role of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear attack. And went on to say that they weren't at a point where they could say sole purpose, as we had called for, but they would work to establish that and going forward. They would seek to have that become the policy going forward. So that was under Obama, some of the work we did there. So where we are now is in the current environment is we are trying to influence the Biden administration's nuclear posture review, which is basically just starting now. They're still in the White House setting the terms of reference for that study to happen. And we believe it will begin later this month or probably in July before it'll be as always has been, a Pentagon-led process where they will attempt to set out what the Biden administration wants to accomplish on nuclear policy questions. The unfortunate news for us is in the initial Biden budget that was released earlier this year, they essentially on the funding side funded every nuclear program that was proposed by President Trump when he was in office, including several new systems that we think are just unneeded, unnecessary, and dangerous. That was disappointing to have the Biden administration do that, given President Biden himself has said that he didn't support those, but that's what happened in the budget request. So we are hoping that we will be able to change that both in the posture review and in the future budget requests that are coming out in this fiscal year. And to do that, we need to have some champions to push the case for us. And the good news is we actually have one champion very much already there, who is Joe Biden himself. On the policy side in particular, he has said some very compelling things, particularly at the end of 2017, just as he was leaving office. He followed up on nuclear posture review and said in his speech, it's hard to envision a plausible scenario in which that made sense. First use of nuclear weapons made sense. And then he followed up by saying, deterring if necessary retaliating attack should be the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons. So basically you have Joe Biden himself declaring that he believes we already can make a sole purpose declaration. So that's we think that therefore we have a good chance of that ending up in nuclear posture review going forward, and we're going to try to push that happening. Similarly, we also, on on the campaign trail in 2019, asked all the presidential candidates for their views on their support or not for a no first use policy. No first use policy being the idea that the US would never use nuclear weapons first in any conflict. And Biden, again, said he supported no first use policy. And we have made a video of that counter. We're now disputing widely on Facebook and Instagram to try and promote the idea. The president himself has been very clear. He supports these policies. He thinks it is important to do that. So I'm going to skip ahead because I'm running out of time here. One more point in our favor, though, is the Democratic National Party platform. That platform itself, this is more on the spending side, well, actually on both sides, that says that, again, sole purpose should be US nuclear policy, and that the Trump administration's nuclear weapons are, quote, unnecessary, wasteful, and indefensible. So we will be using those things said by Democrats and the president himself to hopefully push the Biden administration in ways we believe will be more useful for US security and more appropriate in the world we're living in today. Another thing we're working on, done things like, for example, is a letter from scientists and Catholics to the president, calling on him to take steps to reduce the nuclear threat. We also have an initiative called Back from the Brink that's very creative. Basically, it is sought to get cities and mayors and states to support a set of 5 principles that include no first use, ending the president's sole authority to start a nuclear attack, to end the practice of keeping weapons on hair trigger alert, and to push for reducing nuclear stockpiles in the US and around the world as a priority. And that set of principles has been endorsed by over 350 organizations, 50 municipalities, and 6 states. So California, Oregon, Massachusetts, and others have all endorsed this Back from the Brink proposal that we have been working on for 3 or 4 years now. And we're continuing to press that. We're actually now working on a new piece of that where we're getting officials to sign a new letter to the president himself. So we're actually recruiting mayors, city council members to sign a letter to the president himself, in which they again calling on him to take steps to reduce the nuclear threat. And if you want to support that work, it'd be great to have you doing that. Basically, if you believe, as we do, that the US can reduce reliance on nuclear weapons, a way to do that is to talk to your members of Congress and to talk to your local officials and encourage them to speak out on the issues as well. As you'll hear from Charlotte later, the Physicists Coalition is already doing that themselves. They're actually doing very important work to do some direct lobbying of members of Congress. Right now in Congress itself, there is majority Democrats, I think, agree with the views that UCS has, that we have an over-reliance on nuclear weapons and that we don't need new nuclear weapons to keep our security, but not all Democrats. And it is definitely an issue where there will be a need for President Biden to move carefully if he wants to make changes like we're calling for. So I think I'm going to end it there. That's just the website for Back from the Brink is sprintnuclearwar.org, and I will end it there so we can have time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Let me ask Professor Weiner to come back. And we have some questions that have accumulated during the presentation, so we have time to get through some of them. And so the first question was, could you say something about the appropriations and authorization process that Sharon mentioned towards the end of her remarks and said that she didn't have time for? So can we start with that? Sharon?
Let me let Stephen do appropriation and authorization, and then I'll talk about BA and TOA.
Sure. So Congress definitely is a complicated beast. And the way it's supposed to work is not how it actually works often. In theory, so there are 13 different appropriations bills that need to pass Congress every year. And in theory, all of them also has to be authorized So there's one committee that authorizes spending, says, okay, you're allowed to spend this much money. And authorizing committees also, in theory, create policy from Congress. And the appropriations committees are the ones who actually set, this is what money you get for this. So it's first authorized and then appropriated. The reality is for all but defense spending issues, the authorizing process has fallen away entirely, and there only is appropriations processes. But again, the theory is for military spending, defense spending, it's a two-step process. First, the money is authorized by the House and Senate Armed Services Committees doing bills that include authorizing funding for all weapons programs, as well as setting policy and calling for reports on initiatives. They can create new programs. The authorizers have a lot of leeway in what they can do. And then after it's authorized, the appropriators act second, and they actually give the money. The reality is that it's much messier than that. And this year, the appropriations bills are going to pass first, and they actually have in many ways the final say, except that the authorizers counteract what they do and go second. They can change things in complicated ways. So it really is a very messy system and hard to follow, but there are opportunities in each of those ways where people from the outside can try and shape that process. There are floor amendments, there are getting members to sponsor, to make changes. There definitely are many ways to try and change the appropriations process and authorizing process, but it is quite messy. But the step one is talk to a member of Congress and ask them to do what you want them to do and see if they can help you or not.
Okay, thank you. So Sharon, please.
So I was just going to add briefly. So one would think, the budget process in Congress is about passing a budget, but it's actually about getting as much parochial benefit from any part of the process that you can possibly get, which is why it's inherently political. I mean, the whole process of authorization, especially for defense, started out in the 1950s as you only had to authorize construction. Everything else was just appropriated. And then the authorization committees decided, you know what? We could get a lot more stuff for our districts if we required everything to be authorized. So thus you see the growth of the process and the politics. But I wanted to also draw people's attention, authorization versus appropriation. But when you're looking at the budget, you also want to look, especially the budget for an agency, and how they're spending the money that they were both told they could get and then appropriated. You want to look and understand the difference between budget authority. This is the authority you were given to spend, and what has been obligated. So obligated basically means you gave me $10 and I have decided to buy from Stephen $9 worth of books on his shelf, but I didn't want $10 worth of books, so I'm keeping that $1 in case he buys a new book that I want. Okay, so I have obligated $9 of the $10 that I've been given. But what happens is for programs that are troubled, that are behind schedule or having issues, or where there's some technical difficulty, the agencies can't obligate the money. And so you will start to see differences between their budget authority and their obligation authority. And that's a signal that something is wrong. It can also be a signal that the agency doesn't want to do what it was told to do by Congress. So let's say Congress tells me to do something and gives me money to do it. I'm required by law to do it. I'm supposed to do it. But if it proves exceedingly difficult, and as the years go by, I don't spend that money and it accumulates, and I don't obligate it, eventually I can go back to Congress and ask them to reprogram that money for something that I actually want to do. Now, this happens on the margins actually fairly frequently. The important thing to remember is you can only reprogram money within the appropriations lines that exist. So if you recall back, I said NNSA had 4 appropriations lines. So you can only reprogram money within an individual line. You can't swap between weapons activities and nonproliferation. The other thing, though, to remember is for agencies, if they have a lot of money sitting around that they haven't spent, occasionally OMB will dive in and say, you have to give that back to the Treasury. Return it to me. And so this creates a strong incentive for agencies to spend on a fairly decent clip any money they are appropriated by Congress, even if they don't need it, and even if it turns out they could save money and do it more cheaply, because money you don't spend may go away. I should also just briefly add, and this is probably too much in the weeds, but there's a notion, and if anybody's interested, they can send me a note. there's this issue called the color of money, which is basically some money you're appropriated has to be spent at a given year, and some of it doesn't have to be spent in a given year. And so there are all sorts of strings attached, and this can also be helpful in understanding a program, to understand programs when they're troubled or when they're having problems.
Okay, so we have just a couple of minutes left, and there are questions asking for background information of various kinds, which we can answer separately. But I did want to pick up on one question that Sharon mentioned and was implicit in what Stephen said, and that is that there are other people playing in the same field of trying to influence policy. Could you say a little bit about who those are?
I mean, so you're talking about the contractors and the lobbyists and the military-industrial complex. Basically, that definitely plays a large role in many ways. I mean, for example, last 2 years, we were trying to get a study done to look at the feasibility of whether or not the US could extend the life of the existing Minuteman III ICBM rather than building a new ICBM as the Pentagon was pushing for, the Air Force was pushing for. And we got an amendment to the annual authorizing bill, which would have called for a study to be done independently, an outside study to be done. And it was literally voted down by Congress, which has never happened. Congress never opposes studies, because it's always study. We should have information is good. But this was voted down because the contractor who has the $13.3 billion contract to build the new ICBM lobbied against it. Basically said, I give you money every year, vote against this. And so it was voted down. The Republicans all opposed it, and enough Democrats opposed it that it didn't win. And that basically doesn't happen quite that clearly very often, where it's very clearly a contractor is saying, don't support this simple thing like a study, but it definitely has an influence more than one would hope.
So I would just add, so I used to think that the domestic politics of congressional issues could be pretty rough and tumble until I worked for the White House. And then the internal executive branch squabbles can just be really bloody warfare because there the politics is subtle and in some cases less obvious. So that means the influence of other groups can come through conflicts between the president and a cabinet secretary, between a cabinet secretary and her department. So keep in mind, there are a network of people on nuclear weapons issues that have been around for a very long time. Not part of the government. Well, some of them actually are part of the government. Some of them are for-profit contractors. They stay in places, so they have a huge repository of knowledge. They all know each other, and the political appointees come and go. And so in the battle for influence, it is not fair. It's the career bureaucrats and the contractors and everything else, because like I said, they know each other. They know how the system works. They know the pathways to power, and they can influence politics in a variety of different ways.
Okay, so thank you both. We're now at 4 o'clock, which is the time that we have to end this session. As I mentioned before, there will be time at the end of the webinar for questions for all of our speakers. So please join me in thanking Professor Weiner and Stephen Young for having this conversation with us. And I will hand this over now to Charlotte Selton.
Thank you, Zia. Thank you, Stephen and Sharon, for that great discussion. We're now going to transition to talking about near-term opportunities, specifically looking at no first use as a case study. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Laura Grego, who's going to be addressing why a no first use policy and why right now. Dr. Grego is a senior scientist, research director, and acting co-director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She holds a PhD in experimental physics from Caltech, and her analysis and advocacy is focused on missile defense, outer space security, and nuclear weapons. She's written extensively on relevant topics, including space security and missile defense, and she's testified before Congress and addressed the UN General Assembly and the UN Conference on Disarmament and Security Issues. Later this year, she'll be taking a leave of absence from UCS for a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellowship at the MIT Laboratory for Nuclear Security and Policy. So an exciting expert to have with us. I can't wait to hear what she has to say. I will turn it over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Charlotte. Well, that's a very kind introduction. And thanks all of you for taking time out of your afternoon to really dig into these issues. These were great presentations. I'm just going to spend a short amount of time to remind you all of our efforts around the coalition efforts around no first use. So would you give me a thumbs up if you can see and hear me? Great, thank you. So as Charlotte said, I'm just going to give you a quick 5 minutes on no first use of nuclear weapons, why and why right now. What is it? It is a commitment to never using nuclear weapons first. That is a first strike, for example, and a surprise attack. And that may be mostly what people think about it, but it's really it's a deeper commitment. It's not to use nuclear weapons as an escalatory move in a conventional conflict, and not in response to a non-nuclear attack, no matter how strong. So under such a commitment, the United States would only consider using nuclear weapons in response to a confirmed nuclear attack on itself or its allies. So there are and this is an advocacy effort on the part of the coalition, and here are the reasons why we feel strongly that it's important to pursue such a policy. A no first use policy reduces the scenarios for nuclear use, reduces their importance. It strengthens deterrence, which is meant to emphasize that nuclear weapons are only used to deter other use and not for war fighting. It maintains a clear boundary between conventional and nuclear warfare. And we believe it reduces the incentive for a preemptive or a first strike against the United States. There are concerns and things that of course need to be discussed, including that declaratory policy can be weak without forced changes that support that. For example, China has a very strong no first use policy. And in fact, that's reflected in its force structure. It doesn't have, in general, in peacetime, it doesn't have its nuclear warheads mated with its delivery systems, or not all of it. So it has an extended timeline for using nuclear weapons. Other issues are, I saw this in the comments, that the United States does need to reassure its allies when it makes policy changes like this. There have been concerns about how to respond to possible non-nuclear existential threats if those exist. Of course, I would point to the United States' enormous conventional military as an obvious answer to that question. No first use is consistent with Vice President candidate Biden's public position. Stephen mentioned this in his remarks in January 2017. He said it's hard to envision a plausible scenario in which the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States would be necessary or make sense. As a candidate, he said there is no first use doctrine that we should be pushing. This is also, as Stephen said, very closely related to the Democratic Party platform. It's which is an alternative conception, a sole purpose policy. So the Democrats in their party platform believe that the sole purpose of our nuclear arsenal is to deter and, if necessary, retaliate against a nuclear attack. So it's a similar statement, sort of taking a different part of the problem, but again, focusing the issue and making the only purpose of nuclear weapons to deter and not to be used first. The current nuclear policy does rely on some ambiguity. The US has a policy, of course, that applies to non-nuclear states who are in compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The US will not use nuclear weapons first. And that does include the vast majority of the world's countries. The possible exceptions to that are Russia, China, North Korea, and possibly Iran. But the US reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances to defend the vital interests of the US, its allies, and partners. And that is obviously not made explicit, but that might be taken to include attacks on command and control of nuclear weapons, important infrastructure, massive cyber attacks. Importantly, the United States maintains many nuclear weapons on high alert, ready to be used. For a fuller discussion, so I'm not going to get into all the pros and cons, because we did have a pretty robust discussion at a previous coalition webinar, which is available at the website. I put the YouTube link here, but you can go to the Physicist Coalition website and watch that quite robust discussion. So what, I guess I'll turn then lastly to why now. As Stephen mentioned, the Biden administration is undertaking a nuclear posture review beginning this summer and apparently getting started right now. And so that is a comprehensive look at nuclear policies. And this is a key place where such a thing, such as no first use, a change like that would be decided. Importantly, President Biden himself supports reducing the importance of nuclear weapons and has the Democratic Party on his side of that. And legislative initiatives also support no first use. There have been Congress has tried to make its point of view known. Senator Warren and Representative Smith have a very sort of sharp, clear bill that they are working on, that they've advanced, which just says it is the policy of the United States not to use nuclear weapons first. There's another bill spearheaded by Senator Markey and Representative Liu, which requires congressional approval for a first strike, but they do have the similar sense of trying to circumscribe the role for nuclear weapons. And I'm going to leave you here because Charlotte will take you through what we're actually trying to do to move this policy forward and opportunities that you have to move no first use ahead.
Thank you, Laura. So no first use is the current policy priority of the Physicists Coalition. And the American Physical Society is also deeply concerned about the possible use of nuclear weapons for preemptive counterproliferation purposes. So the coalition is backing a US no first use policy because this would reduce the risk of nuclear war. It generally aligns with our principles, but there's several different routes that we're pursuing to advance this policy. So first, we've sent a letter just earlier this month from 9 members of our leadership team directly to the Biden administration in support of no first use. This letter is available on our website, and I encourage you to go check it out. It's under our policy tab. But we're also pursuing no first use by way of Congress. So as Laura mentioned, the No First Use Act of 2021, introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren and Chairman Adam Smith, would establish as the policy of the United States to not use nuclear weapons first. So we launched earlier this year a letter writing campaign that's ongoing. We've had 113 members of our coalition send over 350 letters to their elected officials across 30 different states. So a good response there, but still room for more growth. However, really making an impact on policy requires us to go beyond letter writing, and that's why we're starting to have constituent meetings. Later this month, 14 coalition members are going to go above and beyond and meet with their elected officials. We have folks from Ohio, New Jersey, California, Tennessee, and North Carolina who are participating, and this is just our start. We chose the politicians that we want to target first based on where we think there's an opportunity to move the needle on no first use. So we looked at the committees that folks sit on. The No First Use Act has been referred to the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So building support within those committees is an opportunity to increase the likelihood of congressional dialogue on no first use. We're meeting with some folks who haven't been previously supportive of no first use, but we hope that hearing from a constituent can push them to reconsider the policy. But we're also looking, we're meeting with folks who have in past Congresses supported no first use, but haven't championed it in this Congress. Because advancing a policy like no first use requires folks who are willing to go to bat for it, to start discussions about it. And the coalition is certainly hoping to be one of those forces that is going to bat for no first use. So we're going to continue working on this policy. I encourage you to join us if that's of interest to you. And we're also going to take any questions you might have about no first use, about the coalition's approach to advocacy, or even about the earlier section of the webinar. So please drop them in the Q&A. Okay, so it looks like we have a question asking about no first use and biological weapons attacks. So would no first use stop you from retaliating with nuclear weapons for a biological weapons attack? Do you want to talk about why we don't need a nuclear weapon to deter that? Laura?
Well, thanks for the question, Dick. I believe no first use policy as constructed as we laid it out here would not allow a nuclear weapon response to anything besides a nuclear use. So yes, it would preclude that. And it sounds like deeper into your question is, could we effectively deter such an attack without nuclear weapons? And of course, that's a matter of debate, and I'd invite your perspective, and I invite everyone else's perspective, but I think that the United States capabilities should be effective in doing that. I personally believe that I wouldn't want the United States to use a nuclear weapon in retaliation for a biological attack, but that my personal belief is not necessary to this policy. I'd open this up to my other panelists too.
So we also have a question from an anonymous attendee asking what the best thing an individual can do beyond contacting their representatives are. I would certainly be interested to hear other panelists' thoughts on this, but I would say one of the best things you can do is talk with your community. I think that nuclear weapons have fallen from a lot of Americans' policy priorities, and we need to increase awareness. So starting those conversations, being a champion within your community is a good way to support the policy without contacting your representatives, or maybe beyond contacting your representatives.
Okay. Can I just add, Charlotte, I think something that actually is helpful is publishing in one of the policy venues that policymakers read in Washington, because in the absence of having a conversation there that critiques or offers an alternative, it's the proposals of the agencies in favor of nuclear weapons that occupy that space. And so even though you may not be winning, the fact that you're contesting is actually really valuable, because in the absence of any critical inquiry, people stop thinking about the issue and assume it's settled.
And I would just add, other things you can do would include writing letters to the editor or op-eds for local papers. That basically ones that mention officials are also incredibly helpful. If you mention an official in a letter to the editor, it'll be seen by the official. I guarantee you, if you write a letter to the editor about to your paper about a member of Congress, they'll see that letter. Won't happen for Biden, but if you write to about a member of Congress, it will be seen. So that's one way to get that perspective out there, is to write letters to the editor or op-eds for local papers. As Sharon said, writing things for publication also is always useful. So definitely a heavier lift, but there are a number of places you can get things published in this space, from Armstrong Today, the Bulletin of Talk Scientists. There's just a number of blogs that focus on these issues that are actually well read. There's even a website called thehill.com that is read by many in Congress that basically takes most things submitted to it if they're reasonable. Actually amazingly easy to get into thehill.com for publication. So the ways you can get your views out there that can be very effective.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Stephen. So I think that there you've got some really good options for how you can make an impact. See that we also have a good question about asking for clarification about how China implements its no first use policy, and how we can make it more concrete, I suppose, how we can verify a no first use policy. Muted, Laura.
Right. That may be directed to me. The question is, how does China implement its no first use policy? Well, China has always been consistent about this in declaratory policy. You'll certainly hear people who profess skepticism that it is a robust policy. So you do look at force structures to see, is that consistent with the way they deploy their nuclear weapons? And as I mentioned, I'm no expert on this, so I don't know all of the numbers, but their forces are not put on prompt launch alert, or not all of them, right? So the sense that there would be a decision taken or I guess in the opposite way, if you had your forces on prompt alert ready to be used quickly, that is less of an indication of no first use. So the absence of that supports their declaratory policy. And all of the policies that we're advocating and we've been talking about are policies that slow down the timeline for nuclear use, that require deliberation before such a consequential decision is being made. So, and I would say that any additional country committing to no first use credibly reduces the possible routes to nuclear war. So it would, the aim would, of course, our lever is with the United States government because, that's where our access to decision makers are. But of course, the world would be increasingly safer the more countries committed to such a policy.
Thank you, Laura. Another good question that I see we have is how would this policy impact the nuclear budget, or would it impact the budget at all?
Let me just jump in here. So it depends on what it comes with. So nuclear weapons exist in two worlds. One is declaratory policy, where the president can basically say anything he or she wants, and it may mean nothing. It may mean something. It's basically an intent that says, I pledge to do this. The other world is operational policy, where you actually make changes to force structure to make your policy have teeth or be possible. It depends on what the policy is. In the US, at least, there's a long history of presidents saying one thing and operational policy lagging, in some cases by 50 years or even permanently. So for example, presidents since JFK have argued they needed flexible nuclear options. And it seems to be the case that the first time we actually really got flexible nuclear options in any meaningful way was under Obama. And that's a pretty big lag, partially because the president can say one thing, but the bureaucracy is going to do what it wants to do, and it takes more convincing. So if Biden decided that with a no first use policy, he actually wanted force posture to reflect that, it could potentially have a huge budgetary impact, because the weapons that are going to be used first are ICBMs. And so if you choose to reduce the level of ICBMs or decide that nuclear weapons on submarines are fine for you, you could significantly reduce or eliminate modernization funding and operation of the ICBM force. So, operations and sustainment of the new ICBM replacement, the Air Force estimates at $264 billion over its lifetime. That doesn't include the $100 billion it's going to take to actually make it. And if you actually look at what's included in their estimate, they're missing a few key things like the warheads that go on the ICBMs. So you're looking at potential savings of hundreds of billions of dollars if Biden chooses to reduce ICBMs to back up a no first use pledge.
Thank you. Very good answer to that. So another question that I see we have is, so what is the perspective on reassuring allies, particularly those on the front lines with Russia or China, if we adopt a no first use policy? I would open that to anyone who wants to take it.
So no first use, people complain that no first use scares the allies because they would somehow doubt our commitment. The allies have always doubted our commitment to defend them, because with nuclear weapons, it basically means if China invades Taiwan, the US will sacrifice, let's say, 100 million Americans to defend it, because if China nukes us. Now, inherently, Taiwan, if I live in Taiwan, I'm going to say, yeah, the United States is not doing that. So extended deterrence has always been not credible. It's always required diplomatic hand-holding and reassurances. I mean, this is why we station conventional forces in South Korea. They're a tripwire. The presumption is if there was ever any war, any attack by North Korea and Americans die, America is more likely to put skin in the game, either by conventional weapons or whatever else. So it's always had a credibility problem. I see no reason why a no first use pledge increases that credibility problem in any way. Moreover, if you look at what Strategic Command says about no first use, they'll say, oh, there's a credibility. The allies, would doubt our resolve. Yet at the same time, they say Russia and China would never believe that pledge. So if the US makes a no first use pledge, why would Russia and China not believe it, but South Korea and Japan would? This is about politics. It's not about nuclear weapons. And so I think even with a no first use pledge, the US can reassure its allies in the same ways it's been reassuring them for the last 50 years.
If I might, let me just add one footnote to that remark that Sharon made in answer to the question about allies. Countries are not monolithic. And people, for example, who study domestic Japanese national security policymaking have written with great clarity and insight about how the fact that there is an enormous debate inside Japan at the highest levels as well as in public opinion about how they see US no first use and whether Japan would want to be defended by the first use of nuclear weapons. And similarly, the same is true in South Korea and in other countries. We also see debates within the NATO allies about reliance on nuclear weapons and US nuclear weapons. In fact, there is a new report just out by the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons documenting how within US NATO allies who are covered by the US nuclear umbrella, there are countries and leading political groups and political figures who support those countries joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which would mean they could not be defended by US nuclear weapons. So if somebody tells you the allies want, the question is, who are they talking about? And are they telling the full story about what the allies are saying and who is making decisions and who is speaking on behalf of whom?
And one additional point I would make is that the presumption is that reassuring allies only goes towards one direction, that you must reassure them with nuclear weapons. And in fact, as Zia mentioned, there are considerable numbers of people and parts of the public in these countries who don't see nuclear weapons as the future for humanity and would like to see leadership from the United States. And it's a liability for the United States to continue to not make progress on its disarmament obligations. So in that sense, that reassures a different set of constituents in these countries. So I would argue that that needs to be considered as well.
Well, thank you all for that very thoughtful answer. If anyone has more questions, we're running low on questions, but we're also nearing the end of our time here. But maybe we have time for one more if anyone wants to throw one in. Okay. Well, in that case, I think that we can wrap it up unless any of the panelists want to make final comments to add to the discussion.
There's been several comments about the feasibility of this happening in Congress or not. And just to be clear, it really is, the bills in Congress that exist really are primarily messaging tools. They're not designed to pass Congress. And as someone else asked, it's not even clear it's legal. Can Congress set policy in that way and have an impact? It really only is seen as a messaging tool. It's designed to show support in Congress and the public for the idea that the US should have a no first use policy. But the prerogative really is the president's. It is nuclear policy is set by the president, and that is where it should come from. In theory, the president could ask Congress to put it into law so that the next president couldn't simply reverse it by fiat. Even that isn't definitely clear constitutionally if that would actually work that way. So yes, it really is, the work in Congress is only intended to be messaging work, and the policy decisions themselves on the first use and sole authority are in the president's hands, not in Congress's hands, just to be clear on that question. And to put another point on the question of how adversaries might react, we had talked a little bit about China. Other point to share on, for example, North Korea, and the reason it makes sense to do a no first use policy is that the fear that North Korea, fearing a US preemptive nuclear attack, might use its own nuclear weapons first. The US couldn't have confidence that it would be able to destroy North Korea's limited nuclear arsenal conventionally. We would certainly try, but we might, if we wanted to be sure we would succeed, we probably would go nuclear ourselves, and therefore that puts pressure on North Korea to go first themselves. If we have a clear no first use policy that's backed up by approach like China has, where the warheads are separated from the delivery vehicles, or even, as Sharon pointed out, if they don't exist, we get rid of ICBMs entirely and develop other steps that would make it clear to North Korea that we would not attack them first. You can make the case that North Korea would be less likely to use their nuclear weapons in a crisis situation. And that's the stabilizing factor that Laura's talking about for no first use policy, is that it makes this policy, if done well, can reduce the likelihood of nuclear war happening at all.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone for attending today, for your questions. I want to thank our panelists for sharing their perspective and their views and their insight. I encourage you to save the chat. There have been lots of great resources dropped in there, lots of good articles. So if you check the little three dot box, you can download it. I invite anyone who is not already a member of the Physicists Coalition to join us. And I also invite anyone to write me an email, share your feedback on this webinar. And again, just thank you. Thank you for giving some of your time today. And thank you for your interest in making a difference on nuclear weapons policy. Have a good evening.
Thank you.